Trump and MBS fell into the same trap in the sense of treating allies with disdain.
Saudi Arabia doesn't have a good record when it comes to military intervention. It did bomb the Yemen for 7 years. It didn't achieve what it wanted to achieve.
But it kind of reminds me a little bit of 1913 or maybe 1938. Less aggressive, less driven by one particular power, more messy, more fragmented, more chaotic. But my God, isn't there real potential here for global trouble? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators. I'm Matt Frei.
And I'm Mark Urban, and this is the podcast where we look at the signals that analysts watch most closely, the telltale signs that suggest imminent and significant change may be coming.
Today we're looking at the Middle East. Again, what started in Iran has spread across the region. Strikes in Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Iraq have marked a significant escalation in the war, with the US launching heavy strikes on Iran as a result.
And with the Houthi attacks escalating and no sign that the US will pull out, the question is no longer whether the war will end, but how wide will the conflict spread?
Well, to discuss all this, we're going to be joined later by Madawi, al-Rasheed, a visiting professor at the London School of Economics Middle East Centre. But first of all, Mark.
Key developments of the week, a lot of them.
Yeah, go on.
Well, look at the Saudi oil industry, somehow still managing to get 60 or 70% of its production out despite the problems with the Strait of Hormuz. How? Pipe it across the country to the Red Sea, ship it out through the el-Mandeb Strait. Of course, what we know in the last 10 days is that the Houthis have shut that down, attacked tankers, and basically closed off that route. Well, there is another way in the Red Sea, north towards Egypt and the Suez Canal. There are some issues there. You have to lighten the tankers and pump things, but there are pipelines there too. And what happened yesterday, but an attack on an American LNG carrier on the Mediterranean side of that, suddenly communicating, and Iranian officials—
in the place of the port of Damietta.
Exactly.
Which is not that far from Port Said, which is, of course, is the opening to the Suez Canal on the Mediterranean.
And Iranian officials confirming to the New York Times it was them that, through presumably one of their proxy groups, did it. And, that's another big step, because obviously Egypt hasn't been attacked yet in this.
That is the first time that Egypt has been militarily drawn into this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So that's a big deal. So the Houthis said it wasn't us, Gov. Was it the Iranians directly? Was it the Houthis, but they're not fessing up to it? I mean, it's this sort of game of shadow, three-dimensional shadow chess.
Totally. I mean, I'm seeing some speculation, among wise people who know the region and the military realities, that possibly Hezbollah from Lebanon could have got a shot with the drones at their disposal across the Mediterranean to that Mediterranean coast of Egypt. But I don't think the Houthis did it directly. But this all speaks to the power of Iran's so-called axis of resistance, its friends and allies.
Which is still going strong, despite the fact that they've been so badly hit.
And I think we've reached a phase in the war where Iran is actively now trying to rebuild it, having suffered a lot last summer and with the fall of the Syrian regime. They're now sensing the chance in this moment to rebuild the axis of resistance. They've been trying to get more weapons through to the Houthis. They're trying to smuggle weapons across Syria to Hezbollah. That's the phase they're in now. Interesting
that, it doesn't take a lot to completely freak out the markets and the insurers and the tanker industry. So you hit a relatively small target in Egypt, and suddenly people are saying what we've just been saying, that possibly, the only last remaining route that's open to the Saudis, if the Bab-el-Mandeb the strait is closed, the Suez Canal, with all its problems, could also be shut down. So the fact that it takes relatively little kinetic activity to make us question, the kind of logic of global trade flows is really interesting. So they don't need to do a lot in this asymmetric field.
And the logic of the campaign that was unleashed back on the 28th of February by the US and Israel, in the sense that their priority on destroying Iranian strike units, like missile units, drone units and stuff like that, was all intended to sort of clip their wings in terms of regional power and intimidation. But of course, what we've seen is, you might account for 80% of those units.
But 20% can do a lot of damage.
Exactly.
So what do you think is going on with the Houthis here? Because the Houthis have been relatively quiet for the last 4 years. And now they've suddenly got even after October the 7th, the occasional missile lobbed at, southern Israel, and the Negev desert mostly. It didn't make any difference. Some of the Israelis made a big deal of it, as you would, because the idea freaks them out. But actually, the Houthis haven't really got stuck in. Why are they suddenly getting more stuck in? Is this the Iranians calling in chips? Are they offering the Houthis something in return? Because for the Houthis, it's a risky game. They're a small but effective entity. They could be wiped out.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and several times since the 28th of February, they threatened to do this, block those oil shipments out of the Red Sea through the el-Mandeb. My interpretation would be that the Iranians, seeing that they've got certain advantages in terms of decision making and psychological advantage, are desperate to get out of this US blockade. And the linkage they've tried to create now is that, okay, we've heard it before over the years from the Iranians, if you stop our oil getting out, we'll stop everybody else's. And that is the sort of logic of that strategy being put into effect, shutting down the Saudis' alternative routes by calling in these favors with the Houthis and others, the militias in Iraq as well, of course, and doing everything possible to create an oil price shock in order to basically get the Americans to think, oh no, well earlier on in this, we actually allowed the Iranian oil out in order to try and moderate some of the market effects. But the Americans say, I saw a statement by Scott Bessent yesterday, the Treasury Secretary, saying that they are determined to double down on this blockade.
But it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, yet again, we find ourselves on forecast indicators going back to the original sin of this war of choice, which is on the 28th of February, they killed the supreme leader. They badly injured his son and successor, the next supreme leader, who we have not seen in public, who we've not heard of in public, who may very well be dead, some people think, or so badly injured, his face burned that he can't possibly speak and can't be seen. But in the absence of his public presence, even if the various factions in Tehran, are paying lip service to his supreme authority, of course, the cat amongst the pigeons, the boss is away, let's do our own thing. So you see the hardliners fighting each other and effectively, calling the shots in this war, literally. And so the big accelerator here was the funeral of the supreme leader a few weeks ago. That brought people out onto the streets. I think the regime the hardliners must have convinced themselves that here was a real show of public support. And they're now using this to double down on what they see as an effective asymmetric strategy in this war against the great Satan, the United States. So after that funeral, things start to fall apart. They start hitting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. So Trump is irascible and unpredictable. The Iranian regime is divided, irascible, and also quite unpredictable. I mean, there's no sense of arbitration. There's no sense of leadership, consistent leadership from either.
Khamenei, the father, was the figure with the authority, wasn't he, to mediate between those different interests, the IRGC hardliners, the business community, all the others in the country. And if you look at the IRGC hardliners, it seems to me that they now believe that all of their big strategic objectives can be achieved.
Yes,
what
absolutely.
are those? To gain control of the Strait of Hormuz and make money from it, to break the US blockade, to
mobilize the Houthis to possibly shut off the other choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb,
and to drive US bases from the region by stirring up popular discontent in countries like Jordan and Kuwait and Bahrain, which they've really been hitting hard to try and chase the Americans out of the region. And they see all of those things possibly coming good now.
And they don't need a nuclear bomb to do it. They don't even need enriched uranium to do it. That's almost a sort of a fig leaf of respect. We can do this as well. They need a few drones, well aimed, perhaps with Russian intelligence, at the right place, at the right time, or the right ship. And they effectively hold the Americans by what.
Yeah. And I think such is their confidence, or you might say hubris, or overreach. I think that they're now looking beyond the point where they've neutralized the US in the region and saying, well, who's the next big challenge to our authority? Saudi Arabia.
Right, the Sunni superpower in the region, exactly. Back to that old narrative, the Shia versus the Sunni power. The other thing is, this is, so even, let's say the Iranians have overplayed their hand. The hardliners have got the better of it. They're going far too far. What's the consequences of their hubris? It's not going to be destruction by America because the Americans aren't going to go in and destroy them completely. The Israelis may try, but they can't do it by themselves either. So we're stuck in this forever war. You know, everyone is an in-betweener on this. I mean, it's a terrible situation
well,
to
the
be
consequence, and you know, although the oil price has jumped in the last 2 weeks and then settled a bit, then jumped again, it's not back up to those really dangerous territory.
Yeah, that's true.
And
even so, sorry, from
does the
$70
US
to $90.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, actually, from 70 to 100,
inflation,
down
in terms
to
of
80,
inflation,
up to 90.
big implications.
Yeah.
But does the US, as it says it will, just sit there in blockade? And that, I think, downstream is potentially quite problematic for Iran. An open-ended blockade is a problem for
But
them.
it's sort of, you know, it's blockade upon blockade, as we know. So, you know, that's bad news for Iran. At some stage, you know, remember the riots in January broke out, the protests because of economic problems. It wasn't so much about, you know, social policy or that stuff. It was economic rates, high rates of inflation. The regime couldn't deal with it. The result were all these people on the streets, and then it got a lot worse. That will get worse as well. But at the same time, you've got the problem in America. You know, so if you carry on with these oil prices, you know, the price of gas, you know, at the pump will go up again just as we head into the midterm elections. I know Trump doesn't care that much about the House going to the Democrats, but he cares a little bit. And the people around him care quite a lot, actually.
Yep. One last thought before we go to our guest. I think this sort of carrying on with a perpetual war and, you know, what's actually the consequences if you're an IRGC senior officer, negative and positive, of course. One of the positive consequences is that the reckoning that might await them with the people on the streets can be kicked down the road, kicking the can down the road, because you can maintain the war mentality and the idea that it's extremely unpatriotic, traitorous to come out on the streets.
But on the converse side, there were some very good reports in the New York Times of during the funeral when Iraqi, the foreign minister, and the Speaker of the Parliament appeared, so-called moderates, appeared on the streets in the context of the funeral. They were shouted at by the crowd saying, "You traitor, 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 you're dealing with the Americans." You know, the memorandum of understanding was as unpopular with that crowd, not all of them, it's not representative of the country, but with that particular crowd and the hardliners, as it was unpopular with the late Lindsey Graham, who was just buried this week, with American hardliners. So anyway, we're in a woeful state here. So let's try and calm things down a little bit and bring in our guest. I'm very happy to say that we've got Madawi al-Rasheed with us on this edition of the Fourcast Indicators. She's a visiting professor, as I said before, at the London School of Economics, Middle East Centre. Okay, Madawi al-Rasheed, it's wonderful to have you on the Fourcast Indicators. Thanks for sparing some time in the middle of a busy summer. I mean, just give us your sort of double espresso version of what you think is going on at the moment. It looks to me as if there is real escalation, both in terms of the intensity of the fighting, the ceasefire being, you know, broken once again, the language used by the president overnight, pretty fruity stuff, but also the geographical reach. What do you think?
Well, I think after 5 months of bombardment on both sides of the Persian Gulf, I can't see anybody claiming victory. There were attempts to negotiate and reach a deal or an agreement or an accord, whatever you want to call it. But it seems to me that both parties are now in a low-intensity war that is draining their resources without actually seeing the end. I think what we have seen in the last week is drawing Saudi Arabia mainly into this war, I suspect on the request of Donald Trump, who is actually stuck in this war. Now, whether bringing MBS to help with the bombardment of other countries is going to lead to any kind of victory, I very much doubt that. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a good record when it comes to military interventions and bombardments. It did bomb the Yemen for 7 years, and at the end, it didn't achieve what it wanted to achieve, mainly the overthrow of the Houthi government in Sana'a. And now the problem is there are so many of these groups, and I'm not sure whether Saudi Arabia did actually bomb the right ones who are allegedly sent drones or small missiles to Saudi territory.
But this is a big moment, isn't it, for the kingdom? I mean, you might say the overt entry of Saudi Arabia into the war, because it was reported that they had been bombing discreetly in April and hadn't announced it. And there seems to be this indecision almost playing out with the Saudis as to whether or not to enter the war overtly, which they've now done, and how to represent it, because they've represented it as something intended to bring about de-escalation. So what do you think of the interests being balanced there in Saudi Arabia, and how do they see, if you think they have a coherent vision, a way out of this?
From day one in February, when the war started, Saudi Arabia always denied that it had participated in a direct way in the war effort of the United States. But having American military bases on Saudi soil and American personnel, it is very, very doubtful whether the Saudis were neutral in this war. Obviously, Iran decided from day one to bomb all American military bases in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf, wherever it can reach. And as a result of that, we have news about Saudi Arabia encouraging Trump to finish the job, and that would lead to regime change in Tehran. But at the same time, the Saudis deny that they have encouraged anybody, and in fact, they are trying hard to stop the war. Now, the problem for Saudi Arabia, the first is domestic. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is humiliated in the last 5 months, together with other Gulf leaders. They have seen this war take place on their territory, in their waters, in their deserts, without being able to have any say over when it started, why it started, and what the outcome is. This humiliation in front of his own people is probably one of the reasons why he rushed. The second problem is the regional dimension, and that is Saudi Arabia has truly lost its leadership role in the not only in the Gulf region, but also in the whole of the Arab and Islamic world. In terms of any kind of diplomacy at the international level, Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman has become completely irrelevant, except to Trump, simply because it has money. But this money is actually deteriorating as well. As we know, the economic situation of Mohammed bin Salman was in a very, very bad state before the war, and which led to him canceling so many of his mega projects. But after the war started, the deterioration in the ability of Saudi Arabia to export its oil has impacted the country, in addition to the psychological humiliation. Now, globally, Saudi Arabia has no friend anymore except Trump, who is very transactional in his relationship with Saudi Arabia. And we saw last week the announcement in the US that Trump had agreed to provide Saudi Arabia with an agreement that would allow them to have nuclear energy for peaceful process, provided that they comply with some kind of conditions, mainly having American supervision over the whole project, which is going to cost Saudi Arabia millions.
But surely one of the other reasons why they might want to join is that the alternative export route, which they'd rather cleverly engineered in recent months using the East-West pipeline, then going down to the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and through the Red Sea. I mean, the Houthis have been threatening that with closure. They've done so in the past. They've done so again recently. If that route is cut off, that is bad news for the Saudis, whose economy is already, the oil sector, I think, is down 25% as a result of the war. The overall growth is down 4.8%. As you said, they were hurting economically before. They're hurting even more now. Regardless of the deal with the US, if the Houthis are serious about shutting down the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, Saudi Arabia's got a big problem. And do they think there's a military solution to it?
Yeah, and the oil industry has been hammered all round, hasn't it, by the Iraqi-based militias. And now this strike on the ship in the Mediterranean that had come through the Suez Canal. So it looks like a sort of coherent attempt to completely shut down the Saudi oil sector.
But my question to you, and I find this fascinating, this relationship between Trump and, Mohammed bin Salman. On one hand, when you see them together in the Oval Office, or when Trump went to visit Mohammed bin Salman at the beginning of his second administration, they seem like the best of friends. I mean, their body language is almost intimate, between these two large, bulky men. They seem to really enjoy each other's company. So does Mohammed bin Salman feel totally betrayed by what Trump has done? Does he feel humiliated by him? Does he feel he has any hold over Donald Trump? Or is Saudi Arabia essentially completely dependent on Washington? What do you think?
I think, the intimacy you see on television for the purpose of media and the social media as well is very clear. The message is that we have this person in Riyadh who could do whatever we like and we could milk him. And this is the kind of thing. But Trump, distributes compliments to all these Arab leaders who tend to be very large. In a way, it's a way of emasculating them. But the heart of the matter is that Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, as previous kings and princes, are 100% dependent on the US for their security, which had actually proved to be ineffective. If Saudi Arabia was protected, then we wouldn't have missiles falling all over.
You talked about the loss of Saudi Arabia's leadership role. I remember in the old days, we used to think that basically Saudi Arabia ran the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the kind of military political alliance of Gulf states. And now, of course, we've seen it going in so many different directions in recent years. To what extent do you think the Iranians have played a smart game of divide and rule here? Because those countries that are really trying to stay in with them, Oman, Qatar, and even the UAE to some extent now, are not getting the missiles, whereas those ones that are very much lined up with the Americans, like Kuwait, Bahrain, and the Saudis, are absolutely getting a pasting this time around. It seems to be a pretty deliberately calibrated strategy, and it must surely further undermine Saudi's standing in the region.
Well, yes, we could blame Iran for dividing the Gulf countries, but they were potentially divisive anyway. We remember the last almost 2 decades, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There was a threat of Saudi invasion of Qatar.
UAE and Saudi more recently. At each other's throats. Yeah.
Exactly. The UAE and Saudi, they have different strategies and they're pursuing their national interests at the expense of a cooperation. But the enmity between these small countries results from the fact that Saudi Arabia wants to play the role of big brother, and it wants them all to be under its umbrella, succumbing to its own policies. And of course, they flex their muscles simply because although they are small, they have a better GDP, Qatar, for example, and the UAE. Oman is trying to manage this conflict and has always been successful in not getting involved in their disputes, but at the same time, it is very limited in terms of what it can provide, given the fact that it's not as wealthy as the others. So Iran plays on these divisions that already exist between these rulers. And in the absence of transparency, of any kind of social pressure, it is basically personalities and their whims that are running the show in these countries.
I just wonder if we could sum up where we are, because it strikes me that in this extraordinary war of choice, where Israel and America kicked the hornet's nest without then sending in the pest control, as it were. The hornets are buzzing around. Every other nest of every other creature in the region is up in arms. So we're in this very strange, seemingly permanent, relatively low-level war. And I just wondered, just getting to the Saudi role, how far do you think they're prepared to get stuck in order to make all these potential problems, which could really blow up even more, go away? Are they hoping that the Americans will do it for them? Are they hoping that maybe ultimately the Israelis will do it for them? Who's going to take the lead in all this?
Or to pay off the Iranians, as the UAE
or to
seems
pay them
to be
off,
doing.
exactly. What will be the decisive factor at the end of the day that resolves this in some form? And what role are the Saudis prepared to play in it?
The Saudis had this sort of historical enmity with the regime in Tehran since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. But there were moments when the escalation subsided. And also the most dangerous aspect of this conflict is the sectarian language on both sides that flares up in times of crisis, such as the one now with Iraq. Remember, Iraq is probably more than 60% Shia, and there is a strong Shia element there. And there is a historical enmity with the Saudis, who are blamed for the ideological roots of a group like ISIS. And therefore, this can escalate. How far is Saudi Arabia prepared to go? It fought an endless, almost 7-year war with Yemen without achieving any objective, just bombardment. And it was almost like a training camp for Saudi fighters with the help of the Americans and the British to bomb this poorest country in the Arab world. But at the moment, we see that the war is becoming sort of low intensity. It's drones, it's low-cost missiles that cause a lot of damage. And if Saudi Arabia is sandwiched between the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, controlled by two groups that are determined to have their way in these two water passages, then Saudi Arabia is actually here for a very, very painful outcome, simply because it cannot export the majority of its oil through pipelines going up north. And therefore, the situation will, not only for Saudi Arabia, but this will be detrimental for the rest of us.
A lot to chew over there. I think in particular, the pretty dismal strategic and economic outlook for Saudi Arabia.
It's a bit like that, that NEOM project that they tried to build in the desert. I mean, lofty ambitions. This sheet of kind of glass and metal and mirror that's cut right through the desert, going to be the futuristic, the city of the 22nd century. And basically it ended up, in the sand, in the dust, and in debt. And you kind of wonder with Mohammed bin Salman, who is such a, physically large bully of a man with obviously some kind of menace and charisma to him and a vision for where his country should be heading, more than, any of his predecessors, as far as I can tell. He's got stuck. And how did that happen? How did this guy get so stuck? He's clearly got a hold over Trump of once. He's a bit taller than Trump. I think that always helps. He's a lot richer than Trump. Even he's richer than Trump. How did he end up getting stuck? And I guess it's just a war of choice, which we cannot say enough, that is not well planned, that does not have coherent reasons for being started, is a really tricky prospect.
Do we not also see that Trump and MBS fell into the same trap in the sense of treating allies with disdain?
Yeah.
At this moment,
actually, that's so true.
At this moment, a united front, be it on the economic blockade or whatever else, with Iran would be very helpful. But instead, we find that some of the Gulf states are quietly picking things up again with the Iranians. Mohammed bin Salman invaded Yemen. And so that whole thing started off. So you've got that whole grudge going with Yemen. He picked fights with the UAE.
Yeah.
He picked fights with Qatar.
Yeah.
A lot of these regional tensions are down to his own, rashness in doing some of these things in past years. And now, of course, that he wants to try and get a united front against Iran, a lot of those other Gulf rulers are not listening to him.
And how ironic that this guy, who is not, living in a bunker at the moment, he's living in a palace, has got, still has more money than Croesus, is unable to get on with his allies in the region who share the same strategic interest, which is that they can't rely on the US and they're frightened of Iran. They've all been hit by the Iranians in different shapes, different forms, at different times. They share that interest. They are unable to form a coherent alliance. And yet, the so-called axis of resistance, which is pummeled and militarily weakened and lives in a bunker, Iran, Hamas, for what's left of it, the Houthis,
Hezbollah,
they seem to be relatively, coherent. They seem to be talking, understanding each other, even if they're not talking to each other. And, it's not a very visible, active front, on the military side, but they're doing stuff in concert rather than against each other, which is an astonishing achievement.
No, there's a coherence there, for sure. There's no doubt about that. And of course, that gives Iran so many escalatory options. And, if they want to hit the facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, as they did this week, but do it from Iraq rather than directly from Iran itself, they can do it. They can do all these different things, or hit the ships in the Egyptian port on the Mediterranean. They've got all these options, and it's much harder for the Saudis.
And a bit like the weapons that are kind of stuck in various bunkers or at the bottom of mountains, the arsenals that the Americans have not been able to destroy. This axis of resistance that's run by Iran has been going for a very long time. It's had many, many, decades to come to fruition. Shared understanding, shared personnel, joint training. I mean, this is a structure, a base which is not destroyed so easily. And I think the Iranians are reaping the benefits of that.
Yeah, they are. But although it's fair to say, 2024, 2025. A lot of their partners were on their knees at the fall of the Assad regime in Syria.
Which is a big one. Also,
the hammering that Hezbollah got from the Israelis. So there were a lot of things that seemed to be going against them.
But they're not totally destroyed.
They've got back into the game courtesy of that decision to start this war in February.
So the DNA that binds them together, even if they are fundamentally weakened, is still there. And again, the disastrous miscalculation of starting a war on the 28th of February with the decapitation of the supreme leader and a lot of people around him, including perhaps his son, deprived. And Trump used to boast about it. Do you remember? He said, we got rid of them all. We killed them all. There's no one left to talk to. Well, guess what?
He said
Mr. Trump, that's not a good thing.
They had achieved regime change was one of the claims, wasn't it?
I mean, what a disaster. And here we still are, 5 months later, shuffling around with indicators of where this thing will go. And we could be here, by Christmas still. I mean, I don't see any obvious end to this war whatsoever. So one of the things, there was an interesting piece written by our friend Gideon Rachman in the FT, and he kind of said, are we seeing the beginnings of a kind of global war, World War III, just to be lurid about it? Now, the first time I heard that, I thought, don't be ridiculous. But then I heard, Nick Carter, the former, head of the army here, General Sir Nick Carter, who's now retired, saying we are already in the foothills of World War III. He said this a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, before this latest war. And then you look at the various cross-fertilizations of what's going on. So you've got the North Koreans perhaps sending another 30,000 troops to Ukraine. You've got Ukrainians hitting Iranian ships in the Caspian Sea because they were taking Iranian drones to the Russians. You've got the Chinese, helping the Iranians with their technology, dual use, obviously also helping the Russians. I mean, these are just it's the beginning, sort of the initial web of interaction that could, if it solidifies, become global and really serious. But it kind of reminds me a little bit of 1913 or maybe 1938. Less aggressive, less driven by one particular power, more messy, more fragmented, more chaotic. But my God, isn't there real potential here for global trouble?
Look, I don't go with the World War III thing for lots of reasons. Principally because the kind of level of effort we're seeing is relatively stable and relatively low. I mean, we're not talking about, once you start talking about world wars, people think about the trenches of World War I. They think about 1,000 bomber raids in World War II. All of that, the Eastern Front.
And I'm not suggesting
so clearly that's not, we're not at that level of, and the fascinating thing is, actually, there's virtually no country in the world that could sustain warfare at a very high rate for any sustained period of time, including the US, as we've seen.
As we've seen, exactly.
Probably the only country in the world that could do it is China. Now, if, as a result of all the things we've seen and the weakening of America in various ways, China decides that 2027 is the year to go for Taiwan, well then,
okay,
we can have the World War III conversation
discussed this a little bit
again.
before, but if I mean, again, I agree with you. I don't think we're talking about, we're not talking about German tanks or Russian tanks rolling through the Champs-Élysées or down the Mall. I'm not saying that. But I think a conflict that is already taking place, literally under the sea in some cases when it comes to cutting cables, in cyberspace when it comes to massive hack attacks. But it's sort of so subterfuge, it's so ambiguous that it's very difficult to call it maybe what it is. Fiona Hill, also a guest on our podcast, said, guys, you've got to take this seriously. This is a kind of global conflict.
Yes.
She used those very same terms.
Yeah.
Now, you could say that the defense community likes to talk in those terms because that's the thing that gets them attention and possibly money and investment. But I think there's something else going on. I think we do need to take it seriously. It will just take a different shape to what it's taken in the past. But it's still worrying. And as you say, the Chinese, what will Xi Jinping do? I'm sure that he wants to do something with Taiwan because that is the one legacy issue that will differentiate him from Mao Zedong, so-called reunification of the Chinese homeland with the Taiwanese. We know they've been doing military exercises, quite specific ones around certain, buildings. I mean, there are these satellite images of props that they built up. They look remarkably like some of the key installations in Taipei, right?
Or ships, American Navy ships.
Yeah. So, they're obviously taking something seriously here. Now, whether they move this year or next year or the year after, whether he's got enough faith in the PLA to actually do this, doesn't look like that at the moment. But he may think that America's distraction in the Gulf, America's weapons stockpiles being run down because of what they've expended in the war with Iran, is a perfect opportunity for him, to strike and do something, whether it's a blockade or a full-scale invasion. I don't think, though, if that happens, that Trump would actually intervene on the side of Taiwan. I cannot imagine him doing that.
No.
What do you think?
I think that's right. I think that's what people in Washington say to me on the down low. You can't seriously think we'd go into a full-on state-on-state war
They've
with
said
China
it publicly as well.
over Taiwan. And the more things develop in the way they have in the Gulf, which is to expose certain American weaknesses militarily, and as we've been discussing, to run down the stocks of key munitions and everything else, the more I think the Chinese will feel they're getting into a position, in classic sort of Chinese military literature style, Sun Tzu, of being able to sort of maneuver the Americans out of the Taiwan area and get what they want without an almighty battle.
So taking everything into account, it's an unsettling picture. It is not so alarming that we need to panic right now, but you've got to watch all these different balls. We haven't even talked about Ukraine and Russia.
No,
today.
We sort of do need to panic in the sense of trying to fill out those aspects of the armed forces and our ability to be resilient as a nation that have been in the policy wonk words hollowed out.
Yeah.
So the lack of sufficient munitions, the inability to defend our own skies in this country from various kinds of attacks, lots of things like that.
On that point, I interviewed Wes Streeting this morning, our brand new defense secretary, and I asked him about, he was in Barrow-in-Furness where the submarines are built. There's a new program to build, I think, 4 more, 8.4 billion quid it's going to cost. And I said, why are you spending all this money when there is no money on submarines, when what we should be worried about is, drones, missiles, undersea cables, cyber attacks, etc. And he more or less said, we have to do all of it. But the thing that he kept going back to, which is so fascinating and actually so labor as well, it's not warfare, it's not the Russian threat, it's jobs.
Yep.
It's growth through bombs, growth through submarines. Jobs, and apprenticeships. But I just wonder whether you think, and what your friends in the military are saying, whether this latest tack from the government, their emphasis on these submarines, is the right way to go or not.
We've got no choice with submarines. We've got the ones that carry the Trident missiles, and then we've got the other ones that are supposed to be finding those Russians who might be trying to cut our cables and do various other things. other things. So they're a key part of our conventional defence, and unfortunately, none of them are at sea at the moment.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of issues with the maintenance of those boats, which is one of the big things that the money announced today is going into is new facilities and docks and all the rest of it, and essentially supporting the submarine force, missile carrying and hunter killers. Through the next decades. So I don't think we've got a choice with that. But, boy, oh boy, it's a lot of money. And in that sense, it can't be politically uncontroversial.
And of course, I also asked him about the fact that, you've got these submarines and like our nuclear deterrent, without America's maintenance of this stuff, nothing much will happen. So we are very heavily, in security terms, in military terms, reliant on the Americans, perhaps more so than any other nation in Europe. Now, how does he rate the fact that the Americans have become so erratic, especially in their war in the Gulf, the on-again, off-again ceasefire, the language used, plus the insults against allies, including you, West tweeting, us here in the UK. How do you deal with that? And he didn't want to go there. He said, we are sticking with the Americans 100%, and we actually, he more or less, I'm paraphrasing, we welcome their language even if it sounds unpalatable because it's concentrated our minds. That's it from the
Thanks
indicators.
for joining us.
From Mark and me, from me and Mark. Bye-bye.